Most people picture the gun. That's the version. Two men step into a saloon, hands drop, and somebody is dead on the sawdust floor before the piano player finishes the chord. It is a clean image. It fits on a poster. It does not survive contact with a single working day inside one of these places. If you walked into a real Wild West saloon in 1881 and stayed for a week, the gun would not be what killed you. The gun was loud. The gun was rare. The gun was almost always somebody's last resort, because the things that actually killed the people inside those buildings were patient, cheap, and invisible. Oh, poo. Built into the walls, mixed into the drinks, dropped onto the floor twice a night, and never swept up properly. Tommins Garai had worked behind the bar of the Broken Drum in Tascosa, Texas, for 11 months when he figured this out. He had come up from Chihuahua at 23, the year the Kansas Pacific crossed into the Texas Panhandle, and a town that used to be a buffalo hide camp sprouted a main street almost overnight. He could mix a drink, set a broken jaw, and keep his mouth shut in 3 languages. The owner hired him for the 3rd skill. Tommins stayed for the first 2. Tascosa was small in 1881, Haparo, perhaps 300 year-round residents, doubling for a few weeks every spring when the trail drivers came through with their crews and their pay. The Broken Drum sat at the north end of Front Street, across from the livery and 1 lot down from the Wells Fargo office. It was a single-story adobe building with a false front, a batwing door that never closed all the way, and a bar made of pine boards laid across 2 empty whiskey barrels. The floor was the same packed earth as the street outside. When it rained, water ran through in little rivers toward a gutter Tommins had dug himself with a shovel over a weekend because nobody else was going to do it. The first thing that killed people in Tascosa was the whiskey, not the drinking of it, the making of it. In the spring of 1881, the only reliable whiskey a cattle town south of Dodge City could lay hands on was what came up the trails from Fort Worth in barrels stamped with brand names that had not been near a grain of rye in years. The drink that came out of those barrels was, in the technical language of the trade, rot gut. In the practical language of the bartender, it was poison mixed with more poison, then cut with turpentine and tobacco juice to stretch the inventory. A bartender named Tommins saw what it did to the men who drank it. The regulars came in Thursday with pay from the drive, steady on their feet, careful with their words, able to count their own money. By Saturday, they were vomiting into the trough out back, their hands shaking too hard to lift a glass. By Sunday morning, 2 of them would be dead in their bunks at the hotel, and the trail boss would shrug and hire replacements on the way out of town. It happened every spring. Tommins had stopped being shocked by the 2nd year. He had stopped being able to look at the barrels without feeling something tighten in his chest by the 3rd. He kept a small tin cup under the bar for himself. He drank coffee. The whiskey was for the men who paid for it. What they did with their money was not, in the way the owner measured these things, his business. What he did not know yet, what he would not understand for another 8 months, until a stranger walked in with a copy of a St. Louis medical journal and left it on the bar, was that rot gut killed in a specific way. The cheap alcohol burned out the stomach lining. The wood alcohol in the mix blinded the men who drank enough of it, slowly, over months, in ways nobody at the time connected to the source. The tobacco juice and the turpentine finished what the rest had started. It was not a single cause of death. It was a small army of causes, all working together, all waiting inside the same glass. A man could survive a bullet. A man could not survive a year of Tascosa whiskey. But the whiskey, Tommins would learn, was only the beginning. There was something else in the Broken Drum that spring, something he walked past 3 times a night and never thought about. And it had been building in the wall behind the stove since before he was hired. It would kill a man named Ezekiel Pratt on a Tuesday in August in a way that made no sense at all until the remains of the wall were pulled apart with a crowbar and a man from the insurance office in Austin looked at the charcoal and said a single word. What that word was, and what Ezekiel Pratt had been doing in the kitchen at 2 in the morning, and why nobody had smelled it before it took hold. That is the part of the story that the history books skip, and it is the part that should not be skipped, because the thing that killed Ezekiel Pratt is still in buildings all over the American West that date from this period. It is in the walls of restored saloons, in the foundations of renovated courthouses, in the rafters of museums that used to be general stores. It has been there for 140 years. Most of it is still there. Before we get to Ezekiel, I'll buy Fuero. I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer honestly in the comments. If you could walk into one real Wild West saloon from this period and spend a full week there, not the movie version, the real one, what do you think would be the most dangerous thing inside? The gun? The whiskey? The roof? The floor? Drop your guess below. There is a right answer. Almost nobody gets it the first time. The word the man from the insurance office said was creosote. Ezekiel Pratt did not work at the Broken Drum. He worked at the livery across the street, and he had the habit of staying late at the bar on Tuesday nights because Tuesday was the night Tommins ran a slightly better bourbonero, a bottle a drummer had left on consignment and forgotten to collect. Ezekiel was 41. He drank slowly in the same chair until midnight. What Ezekiel was doing in the kitchen at 2 a.m. was making coffee. He slept in the back of the livery that month, his wife having just delivered their 4th child. Coffee at 2 a.m. was how he made the night shorter. The lamp he was using was a standard kerosene lamp. Kerosene came from barrels the railroad brought in twice a year, and the railroad did not test it. The man who sold it to the saloon owner said it was a number 1 grade. The man who refined it in Pennsylvania did not label it at all. What burned that night was not the lamp. Behind the cast iron stove, a wall of rough pine boards had been warm for 5 winters. Every winter, the heat drew the sap out of the wood in a slow, invisible exhalation. The sap soaked into the cracks between the boards and hardened into a dark, oily residue called creosote. The property of creosote was that it burned. At 2 a.m, a coal popped out of the stove and rolled against the baseboard. The baseboard was warm. The coal was hot. The creosote was ready. By the time Ezekiel looked up from his coffee, the wall behind the stove was on fire. Not the bright, roaring fire of a building going up. A slow, dense, oily fire that made no noise at all. Tommins, sleeping in the small room behind the bar, woke because the door was hot. He got out through the kitchen window. The livery across the street lost its roof. The Wells Fargo office lost a wall. The Broken Drum lost everything except the bar itself. Ezekiel Pratt did not die in the fire. He died 9 days later. The cause on the death certificate was inflammation of the lungs. The doctor's notes, which survive in the county archive, are more specific. Smoke had filled Ezekiel's lungs the night of the fire. His lungs had not been strong. He had been a sickly man for 2 winters, coughing, too proud to see a doctor. The doctor in Tascosa who treated him after the fire had trained in St. Louis and recognized the symptoms. The smoke had aggravated an existing weakness. The existing weakness had a name: tuberculosis. It had been living in Ezekiel's lungs for years, quietly, the way creosote lives in a wall. The fire did not kill Ezekiel Pratt. The fire woke up something that had been killing him slowly for years, and the waking up was faster than the slow part. This is the part saloon owners did not want to think about, because thinking about it would have cost money. The floor of a saloon in 1881 was not clean. The floor was sawdust, sometimes a full foot of sawdust, refreshed once a week, never fully removed. The sawdust soaked up spilled whiskey, beer, vomit, and blood. The sawdust was, in the language of the doctor who would later tour the cattle towns, a reservoir of contagion. The bar was wiped with a rag. The rag was not washed between uses. A glass was rinsed in a bucket of water, changed, or if the bartender was conscientious, once a day. Most were not. Tommins was. He changed his water twice a day, once at noon and once at night, and he washed his rags in a separate bucket with a piece of lye soap. He did this because he had seen men die of fevers in Juarez when he was a boy, and he had understood, before the doctors had the words for it, that the same water that cleaned a glass could carry the thing that killed a man who drank from it. His owner thought he was being fussy. In the spring of 1882, a doctor named Henry Smith, who had served as a contract physician for the Santa Fe Railroad, made a tour of 7 cattle towns along the rail line. He was looking for typhoid. What he found, in every single town, was that the saloons were the primary point of transmission. the same bucket, the same rag, the same sawdust floor, the same bartender half the time sick himself. Smith wrote a report. The report went to the railroad. The railroad filed it. The saloons did not change anything, which brings us to the loudest thing in the building. The thing everyone assumed was the killer, the gun. The gun in a real saloon was almost never what killed a person. This is not what the dime novels said, and it is not what the movies would later say, and it is not what the man from New York who walked into the Broken Drum on a Friday night in October of 1881 would have believed when he reached for his pistol and dropped 2 men in the time it took Tommins to duck under the bar. The man from New York was named Harold Briggs. He had come in on the evening stage from Colorado. He was loud. He had been loud in Colorado, too, from what Tommins had heard, and the bartender there had thrown him out before he could finish his second drink. Tommins had been told. He had decided not to refuse the man service because refusing service to a man with a colt on his hip and a temper on his face is a different calculation than refusing service to a sober customer with a complaint about the bill. Briggs ordered whiskey. He drank it fast. He ordered another. He asked the piano player to play a song he had heard in Denver. And when the piano player did not know the song, Briggs called him a name that required no translation in any of the 4 languages spoken in the room that night. A man at the bar said quietly that Briggs ought to be more careful about what he called people in Tascosa. Briggs turned. Briggs drew. 2 men were on the floor before Tommins finished the sentence he had been saying to the bartender's assistant. The piano stopped mid-chord. A glass fell off a table and broke against the sawdust without being heard. Briggs stood with the smoke still rising from the barrel, breathing hard, looking at what he had done with the confused expression of a man who had not quite planned to do it but was not particularly sorry either. Tommins came up from behind the bar. He looked at the 2 men. One of them was dead. The other was breathing. But the breathing was the wrong kind of breathing, the wet kind, the kind that means the lung has a hole in it. Tommins knelt beside the wounded man and pressed his hand against the wound, the way he had been taught by a doctor in Chihuahua when he was 16, and he held it there until the man stopped breathing, which took about 4 minutes. Briggs was arrested by the town constable, who had been having dinner across the street and arrived in time to see the smoke clear. He was held for 2 nights in the back room of the general store, which served as the jail. He posted bond. He left on the next stage. This is the version the newspapers carried. 2 men dead in a Tascosa saloon. Harold Briggs of Denver, Colorado. The constable had acted promptly. Justice would be served. This is not the version the doctors carried. A frontier wound from a Colt revolver in 1881 was almost always fatal, not because the bullet was large, the 45 round was the standard, and it was large, but because the wound it made could not be cleaned. There was no such thing as a sterile field. There was no such thing as an antiseptic. A doctor in Wichita in 1880, who had read Joseph Lister's paper on carbolic acid, had tried, once, to clean a wound with diluted carbolic acid, and the patient had screamed so loudly that the doctor's neighbors came over to see whether somebody was being murdered. The bullet that entered a body in 1881 carried with it pieces of the man's clothing, fragments of the wood from the bar, fibers of the sawdust, and any of the small biological passengers that lived in the kind of wood that had been soaked in spilled alcohol for years. The wound closed around these things. Infection set in within 48 hours. If the bullet had missed anything important, and many bullets did, in the chaos of a saloon fight, hitting the bar, the chair, the wall, the piano, and occasionally the cat au bureau, the man survived the shooting and died of the infection that followed. Of the men who were shot in Cattletown saloons between 1870 and 1885, approximately 1 in 4 died at the scene or within hours. The rest died, on average, 11 days later, of infected wounds. The number who survived a gunshot wound long enough to walk out of the saloon under their own power was, by the count kept by the Kansas State Auditor's Office in 1883, fewer than 1 in 3. The gun was loud. The gun was not the killer. The killer was the floor the bullet had been sterilized in, the bar the bullet had been contaminated by, and the sawdust the wound had been packed with on its way to the undertaker. And behind the gun, there was something else, something quieter, something the owner of the broken drum had refused to fix for 2 years, because fixing it would have required closing the bar for a week and losing a week of spring trade. The roof. The roof of the broken drum was made of pine shakes laid over a frame of rough-cut 2x4s. The shakes had been there since 1876. By 1881, they had been walked on, baked, frozen, and walked on again. They leaked in 3 places that Tomans knew of. He had put tin sheets over 2 of them. The third was over the kitchen, where the leak dripped onto the flour barrel, and Tom's had simply moved the flour barrel 2 feet to the left. The owner did not want to spend the money on a new roof. The owner was saving his money to buy a second bar in a town further west, where the trail herds were expected to move in 1882. In July of 1881, a single lightning strike hit the false front of the saloon next door, traveled down the pine boards, crossed the alley through a fence post, and entered the broken drum through the third leak. The water that had been dripping on the flour barrel for 2 years had rotted the boards around the leak. The rotted boards conducted the electricity. The electricity hit the cast-iron stovepipe where it passed through the kitchen ceiling. The stovepipe exploded. Not the stove, oh, whoa! The pipe. The pipe had been a single section, held together with wire, weakened by the same heat that had been drying the wall behind the stove for 5 winters. The explosion blew a hole in the kitchen ceiling the size of a wagon wheel. No one was killed. The bartender's assistant, who had been in the kitchen making coffee, a habit he had picked up from Ezekiel Pratt, who had picked it up because the hours were long and the coffee was free, was struck in the shoulder by a piece of the pipe. The wound was not fatal. The infection that followed almost was. He survived because Tomans cleaned the wound twice a day with the same carbolic acid solution he had read about in a copy of a St. Louis medical journal that a drummer had left behind. The owner of the broken drum, who had refused to fix the roof, paid for the doctor's bill out of his own pocket for the first and only time in his career as a saloon keeper. He fixed the roof the following month. He had planned to use the second bar in a town further west. He opened it the following spring. Tomans Garay poured the first drink in the new saloon on a Tuesday afternoon in April of 1882. The new saloon had a different name. The new saloon had a different owner, who had bought the second bar from the old owner, and who had, Tomans noted without surprise, refused to put a new roof on it either. The new saloon had a new floor of fresh sawdust. The new saloon had a new bucket behind the bar. The new saloon had the same smell, sawdust, old beer, lamp oil, kerosene, cigar smoke, the particular sweetness of a wooden building that had been wet and dried for years. The new saloon had a new bartender who had come up from Chihuahua at 23, who could mix a drink, set a broken jaw, and keep his mouth shut in 3 languages. Tomans watched the new bartender from across the room for a moment. Then he tied his apron, picked up a rag, and went to work. The new bartender's name was Tomans Garay. He had been 23 when he crossed the Rio Grande, the year the Kansas Pacific reached the Texas Panhandle. He was now 26, and he had worked in 3 saloons, in 2 towns, and had not yet learned how to make a building safe for the men who drank in it. He had learned something harder. He had learned that the building was not the danger. The danger was the set of decisions that had been made, over years, by the men who owned the building, and that those decisions were not going to change because he washed his rags in a separate bucket. This is what the mythology of the Wild West gets exactly backwards. The saloon was not killed by the gunfighter. The saloon was not killed by the cattle drive, or the railroad, or the winter of 1886. The saloon was killed, slowly and from the inside, by the same thing that kills most working buildings in most working towns in most centuries. A series of small economies made by people who would not be there to see the cost. The creosote in the wall, the sawdust on the floor, the roof that leaked onto the flour barrel, the bucket changed once a day, the whiskey cut with turpentine, the lamp trimmed with a wick that was too long. None of these decisions killed anyone on the day they were made. They killed people years later in ways that were difficult to connect back to a single choice, which is exactly why the choices kept being made. Tomans understood this. He understood it the way bartenders understand most things over. by standing behind a bar for 11 hours a day and watching what walks in and what does not walk out. He could not fix it. He could not fix the whiskey because the whiskey was the business. He could not fix the floor because the floor was the owner's decision. He could not fix the roof because the roof was the next owner's decision. What he could fix was his own bucket, his own rags, his own hands, his own customers who came in too sick to know they were sick. He did this. He did it for 11 months at the Broken Drum, and then for 3 years at the second saloon, and then for a few months at the third. He died in 1889, in a town whose name nobody writes down anymore, of a fever that began with a cut on his hand and ended 11 days later in a room above a livery that smelled, he told the doctor on the last night, exactly like the back of every saloon he had ever worked in. The fever was preventable. He knew that. He had known it since he was a boy in Juarez, watching men die of the same thing he would die of, in the same way, in the same kind of room. He had spent his working life trying to prevent it in others. He had not been able to prevent it in himself, because the prevention would have required a different kind of saloon, in a different kind of town, owned by a different kind of man, and he had never worked in one of those. He did not, as far as anybody knew, regret the choice he had made. He had chosen to work where the work was. He had chosen to keep the bucket clean. He had chosen to wash his hands. He had chosen, when he could, to refuse to serve a man who was too far gone to know it. The choices had not saved him. They had, in a way that was not visible from outside the bar, saved some of the men he served. He had understood the difference. He had not needed anyone to explain it to him. If you made it this far, you stayed with a part of the history that the poster never shows. Thank you for that. Now, I want to ask you something different from the usual question. After everything you just heard, oh, the whiskey, the fire, the sawdust, the bullet that did not kill, but the floor that did, the man who cleaned his rags and died anyway. Oh, what is the first movie that comes to mind? Not the most accurate one, not the most realistic one, the first one, the one your brain reached for while you were listening. Drop it in the comments. I want to see how the mythology and the history line up Eshawo and where they do not. And if this is the kind of story you want more of Eobro, the history underneath the legend, the part the posters never showed, Eriro, subscribe. The next episode is about a man who was not a gunfighter, who did not wear a badge, and who probably did more to keep the West functioning than anybody with a poster ever did. His name was not famous. His job was. You will know it the moment I say it.